Folks, 40 years ago, this is really huge. Listen carefully. 40 years ago, I remember it well, something unprecedentedly horrible happened. It was November 1978, 40 years ago. The Reverend Jim Jones, some of you now know what I'm talking about, he orchestrated the murders and suicides of almost 1,000 people at a remote jungle outpost in South America. It's just something that when it happened, the pictures, the whole thing, it was mind-blowing. He was somehow portrayed as a fundamentalist Christian guru, but 40 years later, a book has come out that tells us, no, that is not only not the case, it's dramatically opposite to the actual case. The book I'm holding in my hand, it's called Cult City, C-U-L-T, Cult City. Jim Jones, Harvey Milk, and 10 Days That Shook San Francisco. The author, Daniel Flynn, is on the line. Daniel, welcome to the program.
Hey, thank you for having me.
This is a staggering story, absolutely staggering. Give my audience the guts of it so they know what we're going to be talking about in the next hour.
Well, in 1977, Jim Jones, the world started crumbling in on him. There were a number of media reports that he had been orchestrating fake faith healings, pressuring members to turn over their assets, their property, that he was involved in these beating members of his flock, all sorts of just nasty activity. And so he was really a darling of the political establishment in San Francisco. And then very quickly, he absconded to South America, and he had about 1,000 people follow him down there from San Francisco. And this, they had set up a commune down there in the mid-'70s, and very few people lived there at that point. But then, all of a sudden, there's this influx of about 1,000 people, and they're living in the middle of the jungle in South America. One of the persons that he took was a 6-year-old boy by the name of John Victor Stone, and his parents were in the United States, and they wanted him back. And so this set up kind of a custody case, and there was a court order to bring this kid back to the United States. There were a number of relatives in the United States that were very concerned that this was not a commune, but really a concentration camp. And so Leo Ryan, a congressman from San Mateo County in California, went down to Jonestown with a group of media members to investigate conditions and hopefully get some people out of there, which he did. But Jones sent a hit squad, a group called the Red Brigade, and they assassinated Congressman Leo Ryan. They killed 3 journalists, and they killed one of the escaping members. And that set off a wave, what Jones calls revolutionary suicide. And this was a term that he got from a book by Huey Newton, in which people were supposedly killing themselves for the betterment of mankind to protest the conditions of the world. That's how he spun it. And his followers, they bought into it. And you can listen on the death tape of them killing themselves. You hear one person, one adult objecting, and numerous people saying how great it was that they were killing themselves for communism, for socialism, and how they were thanking Jim Jones for this. And so you had, about 909 people within Jonestown kill themselves, so where we get the phrase drinking the Kool-Aid. They actually took Flavor Aid laced with Valium and about a penny's worth of cyanide apiece. And initially, they thought maybe a few hundred people had killed themselves, but they realized that people were sort of piled upon people, and they were rotting in the jungle. And ultimately, there were 918 people that were killed in Jonestown, in the capital, in Georgetown, Guyana, and also in the airstrip outside of Jonestown.
Okay, so this was really a mass murder on an absolutely horrific scale. Jim Jones was, I don't hesitate to call him a satanic figure, a truly evil, wicked, Machiavellian human being. So then the question becomes, why did Harvey Milk, who was the first openly gay mayor of any major city and who's been celebrated in the gay world for over 40 years since he was killed, why did he praise Jim Jones? Why did George Moscone praise Jim Jones? Why did Willie Brown praise Jim Jones. So many of these major figures on the left in California lionized the man whom we now know to be an evil mass murderer. What was the link between Harvey Milk and Jim Jones?
Well, I think there's two parts of it. The first is that Jones echoed the things that Milk and Moscone and Willie Brown and the others wanted to hear from the pulpit, but really didn't. Jones supported gay rights at a time when it was very unfashionable to do so. He was very much involved in supporting the various radical causes favored by certain African Americans, very much a supporter of Huey Newton and Angela Davis and other cause celebs at the time. So that was part of it. The other part of it was that there was a transactional politics involved, whereas Jim Jones would offer volunteers, a printing press, all sorts of publicity for figures mainly in the Democratic Party, and in return, they would give him legitimacy. And Jim Jones really got the better end of the deal. And so for Harvey Milk, who was kind of a perennial candidate, he didn't go anywhere in politics until he came upon Jim Jones. And Jim Jones gave him hundreds of campaign volunteers, conscripted volunteers. He gave him boosterism in People's Forum, their newspaper. He gave him the pulpit to speak to the members of People's Temple, which Harvey Milk did. And in exchange, Jim Jones got something much better. So when things started going bad for Jones, Harvey Milk used his position as a supervisor in San Francisco to write various world leaders and lobby on Jones's behalf. He wrote President Jimmy Carter that Jones was a figure held in the highest regard in the minority community. He was a man of the highest ethics. He said that the parents that were trying to get their little boy back, one was a blackmailer and the other was a teller of bold-faced lies. So in essence, he took the side of the kidnapper versus the kid's legitimate parents, and that kid died in Guyana. He wrote to Joseph Califano, who was the Secretary of Health, Education, and Welfare, saying that Jonestown was a beautiful retirement community that people would pay thousands of dollars to belong to, that it was alleviating the world food crisis. This was a time when people were starving in Jonestown. They couldn't even make food to feed everyone. And he said that they were alleviating the world food crisis. There was all sorts of just propaganda, lies that he was telling various world leaders, including Prime Minister Forbes Burnham. He wrote him, "Such greatness I have found in People's Temple." And so when you're in Guyana, when you're a politician in Guyana, and you don't know anything about this People's Temple, and you're getting letters from, Harvey Milk, you're getting letters from Willie Brown, you're getting letters from the Lieutenant Governor of California, Mervyn Dimely, saying how great this Jones guy was. Mervyn Dimely actually went with Jones on an airplane to Jonestown. He came back to the United States, and he said he was tremendously impressed. This was a concentration camp that he was looking at, but he was telling everyone how great it was. And so for the folks in Guyana, this obviously gave them pause what to do with regard to these reports of, possible mass suicide and people being abused in their own country, because so many powerful people in the United States were telling them, no, Jim Jones was a great guy.
Well, but just to go back, it sounds like Harvey Milk never would have been elected without Jim Jones.
Yeah, that was certainly a big part of it. He ran for office 4 times and he didn't get elected until 1977. At that point, a lot of the People's Temple members had already fled to Guyana, but there were still enough people in the United States that were helping him. When he put on a street fair, for instance, and he had to get entertainers, he got the entertainment from People's Temple because they had really professional level people there. So there was a very close relationship.
We're gonna go to break. I want to find out more about this. This is so fascinating, folks. I'm talking to Daniel Flynn, is the author of Cult City, brand new book about Jim Jones, Harvey Milk, and 10 Days That Shook San Francisco. It's the Eric Metaxas Show. Folks, it's the Eric Metaxas Show. We're talking about something that happened exactly 40 years ago. This is the anniversary of the horror known as Jonestown in South America. Nearly 1,000 people murdered or really forced to commit suicide. Absolutely horrifying. 10 days later, the assassination of Harvey Milk. Strange time. I never knew that these things were linked until I saw this book called Cult City by Daniel Flynn. Now, Daniel, what is the standard narrative on this? In other words, when we think about James Jones, we think about him as a cult leader. Cult leaders are usually smeared as being right wing. In this case, he was very dramatically and devotedly left wing.
Yeah, when the news initially hit, and often this happens in the first draft of history, people mess things up. Walter Cronkite said that they were fascists. The New York Times said that Jones preached fundamentalist Christianity. The Associated Press said that they were religious zealots. Now, the reality of the situation, I interviewed a number of survivors from Jonestown, and a couple of them told me that when anyone who was bringing the Bible into Jonestown, it was confiscated. They were not redistributed until the commune ran out of toilet paper, and they were instructed to use the Bibles in that way, without getting into detail. That would be a very strange act for any fundamentalist Christian to.
Well, it sounds like, let's be clear. I mean, if you're doing that, that's as anti-Christian as you can be. So even to call oneself a reverend, why did Jim Jones, who hated the Bible, putting it mildly, why did he say he was the Reverend Jim Jones?
Well, I think he is probably the best authority on this. And he in an autobiographical tape that he made, he said that he wanted to know, what was he going to do with his life? And he thought the thought was, how can I demonstrate my Marxism? And he said the thought was to infiltrate the church. And so Jones, who was a liar and not always the best authority on Jim Jones, I think spoke with more than a grain of truth there, that he wanted to use the form of Christianity to attract people. He used this sort of Pentecostal form where he would pretend to heal people of cancer. He said he healed Huey Newton's parents of cancer and various other people. He said he rose people who were dead from the grave. They made many specific claims regarding that. And so that was what got a lot of people in there, particularly older people who had ailments. They thought that he was actually healing people. And the price that they paid for that is that he would often go on rants for hours at a time about socialism and the evils of capitalism and that kind of thing. And so, ultimately, once they are in the church, they realize they're not in a church at all. It's a people's temple. It's something that is a political pressure group that's promoting far left, socialist kind of thing. And in San Francisco at the time, this was the hangover after the high. You had the high of the 60s with the Summer of Love and Haight-Ashbury. And in the 1970s, there's always a price to pay for that party. And you had that price to pay with the Zodiac killings and the Zebra killing and the New World Liberation Front, the Symbionese Liberation Army, all of these crazies, political crazies in some cases, really terrorizing the city of San Francisco. Multiple figures. Dianne Feinstein, the New World Liberation Front, put a bomb on her daughter's windowsill. Art Agnos, who later became mayor, was shot by the Zebra killers. So a lot of politicians, it was a very risky profession in San Francisco in the 70s. In that kind of an environment, Jim Jones looks a little bit mainstream compared to all that. And so you had legitimate figures flocking to him, including, when Walter Mondale came to campaign in 1976 for the vice presidency of the United States, one of the first guys he meets when he gets off the plane on the tarmac is Jim Jones. When Rosalind Carter, President Carter's wife, comes to San Francisco, Jim Jones introduces her. They have a phone conversation, at least one that we have that the transcript is in existence. She refers him to her sister-in-law, Ruth Carter Stapleton, who's in the ministry. They have dinner together. So he has a very tight relationship, not only with the politicians in San Francisco, but many national powerful figures.
So he's a socialist, communist, and ultimately it's clear that he's a very sick, evil man. What is the relationship between him and Harvey Milk? In other words, or I should say, Harvey Milk's assassination, which has been, talked about. The movie was made with Sean Penn recently, that, Harvey Milk is this ultimate hero. What does his assassination have to do with Jim Jones?
Well, I think it really puts the exclamation point on the 1970s in San Francisco, which was a very chaotic decade. And those two events happening within 9 days of one another they would be the biggest events in the history of that city in any decade. And the fact that they came within 9 days of each other, they're going to be forever linked. Beyond that, both of the victims in the assassination, George Moscone and Harvey Milk, were two of the biggest boosters of Jim Jones in San Francisco. With Moscone, just to give you an example, he actually appointed Jones to the Housing Commission Authority in San Francisco, and Jones quickly becomes the chairman of the Housing Commission Authority, effectively making him the largest landlord in the city of San Francisco, which is pretty terrifying when you think of what he did to his tenants down in Jonestown. When we think about mass murderers and serial killers, we don't think Charles Manson and Ted Bundy and guys like this holding positions of great power within, great American cities. But in Jim Jones's case, he did hold great power in San Francisco. And you had people like Willie Brown comparing him to Martin Luther King and Mahatma Gandhi. He wrote Fidel Castro saying that Castro should offer Jones a state visit when he came to visit Cuba. He said he was a highly trusted brother in the struggle for liberation. They really went overboard to legitimize this guy. And part of the reason, we think, how could all those people be so foolish down in South America? Well, part of that reason is because people that they trusted in government, in the media, in Hollywood, all vouched for Jim Jones. Jane Fonda wrote Jim Jones a letter saying she wanted to be an active and full participant in the People's Temple. She was so hyped up after going to a service at People's Temple. Jim Jones regarded her as a member, and when you read her letter to Jim Jones, you get the feeling that he was right, that she was a member of People's Temple. That's not the information that you're going to get from any of the documentaries that air this weekend.
Unbelievable. I wish you had made a documentary that would be airing this weekend. This is just stunning. This is stunning. We've got to put this program on YouTube so we can get this out there this weekend if possible, because this is so important. Tell us how you have Dianne Feinstein mentored the man who murdered Harvey Milk. How is that possible?
Well, Dan White, immediately when he assassinated Harvey Milk, there was sort of this revisionist history that he had killed Milk because he was gay. Now, when I kind of half believed that when I started this process, but, I came to find out very early that was not true. I interviewed Dan White's chief of staff, his campaign manager, his business partner, the first guy he hires when he goes into politics, a guy by the name of Ray Sloan. And Ray Sloan said to me, matter of fact, look, I'm gay. I think Dan White knew I was gay. He didn't care. We didn't talk about it. But this is the first guy Dan White hires. And so the idea that homophobia motivated Dan White, it doesn't really mesh with the reality of his life. He was a centrist Democrat in San Francisco. He, supported gun control. He was for affirmative action. He was basically the Public Employees Union's representative on the board, and he resigns from his spot. And a few days later, the public employees unions were saying, "What are you doing? We walked precincts for you. We manned phone banks, and now you're resigning." And he thought about it, and he asked for his seat back. Mayor Moscone initially, very publicly, said, "You can have your seat back. I'm not accepting your resignation." Harvey Milk got into Mayor Moscone's ear and quite sensibly said, "Look, this guy is the reason why we're losing so many 6-5 votes. You'd be crazy to appoint this guy. Why don't we just get someone new?" And Mayor Moscone thought about it and said, "You know what? I'm changing my mind." This set Dan White off, and Dan White was not a very stable guy, and there's a lot in my book to support that. People that knew him very closely, rivals, political rivals, and others that we talked to, give evidence of a very long history of violence. And I don't mean just fistfights from Dan White prior to this. And so Dan White was a guy who didn't like to lose, was very tightly wound, and he came to City Hall on November 27th, 1978. He killed the mayor, and then he killed Harvey Milk. And so the chance about White later was Dan White, hitman for the new right. His voting record doesn't support that at all. He was very much a protege of Dianne Feinstein on that board of supervisors. She kind of took him under his wing.
And it takes us 40 years to hear about this. I just can't believe it. I hope people will get your book. We're going to be right back, continuing our conversation with Daniel Flynn, the author of Cult City. Grab a copy. Folks, this is Eric Eric Metaxas Show. We're talking about something that happened 40 years ago, exactly 40 years ago. Very, very important correction of the record. Many people over the years think that the murder of Harvey Milk and Mayor Moscone was animated by homophobia. That's not true. Many people believe that Jim Jones, the cult leader who oversaw the murder of nearly 1,000 people in Jonestown, was himself somehow right-wing. Precisely the opposite is true, very dramatically true. And not only was he not any kind of a Christian, he was bitterly opposed to the Bible and commanded his people to use it for toilet paper. I mean, these are things I have never heard. I'm talking to the author of a brand new book. Daniel Flynn is the author of Cult City, Jim Jones, Harvey Milk in 10 Days That Shook San Francisco. It's just staggering stuff. What led you, Daniel Flynn, into the story and to write this book?
It happened when I was very little, and I remember thinking it was the weirdest thing that I had ever heard in my life. And when I was an adult, I heard that Mayor Moscone had appointed Jim Jones to the Housing Commission, that he was the chairman of the Housing Commission in San Francisco. And I thought, that's the weirdest thing I've ever heard in my life. And we touched on that earlier. And so once I heard that, I thought, well, there's part of the story that we're not hearing. And that set me off. And I spent 10 years of my life researching this. I made my first research trip to San Francisco in 2010. It's not easy to find. There's not many survivors of Jonestown around. So finding them and being able to interview people who were shot by Jim Jones's goons, or a guy who was the second in command of People's Temple who defected and basically became their number one public enemy. It's some of these people, because they lived through a very depressing time, they're not very eager to talk about it. And so it took me a long time, but I did, I spent a decade of my life off and on writing this thing, and I'm just glad to have it out.
Well, one of the most dramatic things on the back of your book, you have these encomia from famous figures. You have Jane Fonda and Harvey Milk and Governor Jerry Brown and Tom Hayden, who eventually married Jane Fonda. All of them signed a statement of support for this mass murderer, Jim Jones. They wrote, "We are familiar with the work of Reverend Jones and People's Temple and have no hesitancy in commending them for their example in setting a high standard of ethics and morality." That is like a glowing praise of Adolf Hitler or of Stalin. It's the most bizarre sentence. How is it possible? I mean, were these people blinded because of their political views? In other words, if somebody's on the right side of your views, and we're all guilty of this, right? That you just look the other way at troubling hints.
I think that's a big part of it. And I think the other part of it is that for people on the left, it's very hard to find, ordained ministers with a big following who speak their language. And they found that in Jim Jones. And so they're very grateful for that. And the other part, the big part, is it was transactional politics. Jones, because he was essentially the dictator of all these people, he was able to order them to write letters en masse for a particular cause or to volunteer en masse for any sort of candidate that he wanted to support. People found it really odd when Rosalind Carter came and Jones introduced her, that the biggest cheers were not for Rosalind Carter, the woman who was going to be First Lady of the United States, but they were for Jim Jones. And there were hundreds and hundreds of people. And people thought, wow, usually these political rallies, they weren't like Donald Trump rallies back then. They might have 50 or 100 people. But all of a sudden, if you have 500 screaming people, almost acting like it's Beatlemania or something like that, all of a sudden Jones, he gets this sort of inflated power because they're looking upon him as sort of a godsend for their political prospects. I think the other part of it is that San Francisco is a one-party town. And anytime you have a one-party town, there's not a whole lot of checks and balances, that people are able to get away with things that they wouldn't normally be able to get away with if there was some sort of adversarial process within politics, and that was certainly absent from San Francisco in the 1970s.
Well, let me ask this, because there are many young people listening to this program who don't understand. I mean, I've referenced this mass suicide, this mass murder. Why, and again, there's no good answer, but ostensibly, why did Jones want to have 1,000 people murdered or to commit suicide, forced suicide, or to be shot? What was going on in South America? Why did these people flee to this place, and why did he want them to be killed? What was his thinking?
I think he realized that his ideology was coming up against reality. He thought that they could go down there and live the principles of socialism, and it would be a land of milk and honey. And it was a very difficult process. Just, leave socialism aside. The idea that you're going to take people from American cities, from urban environments, and make them farmers in a climate that's not really suitable for that, that's going to be very hard for anyone. And he realized, he was looking around, and he saw failure everywhere he went. I don't think he could reconcile his ideology failing with the reality of
So
that.
he thought they would just take an exit straight to heaven. We're going to be right back, folks, talking to Daniel Flynn. The book, very important book, Cult City. Hey there, folks. It's the Eric Metaxas Show. I'm talking to Daniel Flynn. The book is Cult City. Jim Jones, Harvey Milk, and 10 Days That Shook San Francisco. Daniel, this is an amazing story, and it's amazing to me that it's taken 40 years to get this out. I mean, apart from your book, the narrative, the nonsensical narrative that has been going on for 40 years. I mean, what you write about is pretty straightforward. Has anybody else hinted about this, or, I mean, are you really the first one to break this?
I think on certain things, they hint at it. The documentaries, they certainly mention Jones's politics, but I think it's glossed over. The alliances that he had with certain media members, Hollywood types, celebrities, and politicians, that's very difficult for a lot of people to stomach. The idea that their heroes view Jim Jones as a hero, that's hard for people. I mean, Jerry Brown is the governor of California, and he was the governor of California then. He spoke at People's Temple. He thought of Jim Jones as a great guy. And, you're not going to run for governor and say, oh, yeah, remember that time back in the 70s where I fell for Jim Jones. Willie Brown is a hero in San Francisco. You think of a guy like Herb Cain who won a Pulitzer Prize. They have a Herb Cain Way in San Francisco. He was the biggest booster of Jim Jones in the press. The most prominent address in San Francisco is City Hall, and it's one Carlton B. Goodlett place. Carlton B. Goodlett was the most aggressive promoter of Jim Jones, so much so that after People's Temple, after Jonestown happens, Carlton Goodlett gets on television. He still defends Jim Jones. He attacks the people that, the media, Congressman Ryan, the concerned relatives who were, desperate to get their family members out. He attacks them, praises Jones, and the worst thing he can say about him is that it was an act of rascality. That's the only time I've ever heard anyone refer to murdering over 900 human beings as the act of a rascal. But this is what this guy did on television, and they, 20 years later, they put his name on the street that gives City Hall its address. So I don't think San Francisco really learned that lesson. They don't honor the People's Temple. All those people that died, they have a small memorial in Oakland. They had no affiliation with Oakland. They had a temple in San Francisco. San Francisco completely ignores them. And they're naming a terminal of San Francisco Airport after Harvey Milk. They have the City Hall named after Carlton Goodlett. Phil Burton, who was a prominent congressman, there's buildings named after him. George Moscone. Nothing for Leo Ryan, the hero of this whole event, and nothing for People's Temple. There's something very insulting about all that.
How many of the 918 people who were murdered were black?
About two-thirds of them.
Okay, and that's itself staggering that this was mostly black people that were murdered, that the man who did this murder, of course, was white, and he was a radical socialist, and he brought them down there to create a socialist utopia and failed so miserably that he thought the only way out is to murder all these people. I mean...
What's amazing is that on the death tape, there's one woman, a black woman, 60-year-old woman named Christine Miller, who stands up to Jones. And her, she's very logical for most of what she says in saying we should not kill ourselves. She's the only one, by the way. But her alternative is let's all go to the Soviet Union instead. Now, those were the choices in Jonestown. That's how brainwashed these people were. that at that point the choices available to them were either A, let's all kill ourselves, or B, let's go live in a communist country way around the world.
Isn't this, it's almost like the antithesis of the Pilgrims, right? In other words, instead of wanting to spread, true faith and succeeding, these people had the most perverse faith, a faith that is already on the ash heap of history, communism, socialism, unless you remember Alexander Ocasio-Cortez, who still seems to think that this can work. Venezuela is this story writ large. It's fascinating to me that it takes until now to expose this as a failed socialist colony. I mean, that's what this was. I've not heard that, nor have I ever heard of the link between Harvey Milk and Jim Jones. It's just a stunning thing. Have you thought about making this into a documentary? It seems that it ought to be a film.
There actually have been people who've approached, but, it's one of those things where, you believe it when you see it. I would just be pleased if people went out and read the book, because it is one of the major events in American history. It's certainly the most bizarre event that's ever happened in American history. But up until 9/11, it was the largest single civilian loss of American life. And yet it doesn't have that stature of a Pearl Harbor or a 9/11, despite the fact that, as you said, you had almost 1,000 people die.
Well, I still don't understand precisely why, it's you can fail in a lot of ways, but to take this kind of dramatic step, why do you think Jones insisted on murdering everybody? I mean, that is, it's as grandiose as it gets. I mean, it's like Hitler in the bunker.
That's the point. You say grandiose, and that's a good word. I spoke to a guy who was the second in command. He said that Jim Jones was a classic narcissist to the nth degree. And when those people were leaving him on that day with Leo Ryan, he felt like his whole body was being ripped apart. He had been planning revolutionary suicide for at least 4 years. They had a number of dry runs. And in each of those dry runs, people didn't die. And so the people who were taking the poison down there, they had done this in the past, and they didn't die. They were surrounded by archers, gunmen. Also, the fact that there had already been a number of people murdered at Jones's command. All of these things put them in a very bad spot. And you add to this the fact that these are hardened communists down there, and Jones is telling them that you're dying for the glory of communism. And when you hear the people on the death tape praising Jones and thanking him for allowing them to die, they're saying, this is so great that we're allowed to die for socialism, and they think the world is going to see this. And what Jones said is that this is not suicide. This is revolutionary suicide, protesting the inhumane conditions of the world. That's what he thought this was about. Obviously, people saw it very differently.
Well, it's just unbelievable. I'm so glad to have you on. We'll be back for a final segment with Daniel Flynn. Folks, the book is Cult City. What a story. This story needs to be told. It's taken 40 years, but finally we know the truth. We'll be right back. It's the Eric Metaxas Show. And I'm talking to the author of Cult City, Dan Flynn. We'll be right back with Dan, but I just want to remind you of Hillsdale College. We've got a website, metaxasforhillsdale.com. It's not enough to criticize what doesn't work, folks. It's one thing to say socialism is a failure. What do you replace it with? At Hillsdale, every student at Hillsdale College learns the principles of Western Christian thinking, the principles of American exceptionalism, self-government, all of those things. Of course, everyone there learns about the Constitution. It's an extraordinary place. Everybody gets a comprehensive education. They all have to take what's called the core curriculum so they can learn all of these things. It doesn't matter what your major is. Everybody at Hillsdale gets this understanding of what is the good, the true, and the beautiful. Why do we do this and not that? Why is this advisable and not that? Why do these societies flourish and these fail? That's the Hillsdale core curriculum. You can go and find out more at metaxasforhillsdale.com, metaxasforhillsdale.com. A few minutes left with Daniel Flynn. Daniel, first of all, again, congratulations on the book Cult City. I know that to write a story like this and to do the research that you did must have taken you a great, great effort. Congratulations.
Thank you.
Finally, we're at the 40th anniversary of this. you're telling me that this weekend, and as people talk about this, they're glossing over the main facts that we have been talking about.
Yeah, the alpha and omega of People's Temple is that it was a political pressure group. It was a hard left communist group, explicitly communist. And if you listen to the death tape, they talk about their communism quite a bit. If you listen to any of Jones's sermons, that's the overriding theme, that there is no God in heaven, that socialism is God, and because he's the personification of socialism, that makes him God. That was his theology in a nutshell. The idea that he was some sort of fundamentalist preacher, as the New York Times put it, there's no facts that support it. No one in People's Temple would ever say that, and none of the existing transcripts support that.
Well, it goes beyond no facts to support it. There's an infinity of facts rebutting it. I mean, the idea that they would use the Bible as toilet paper tells you about everything you need to know. I mean, that's extraordinary to my mind. And also the idolization of this man is profoundly sick and unbiblical. I mean, it really is just, I don't shrink from calling it demonic. I mean, a figure like this who in effect impersonates a man of God, and makes himself out to be God. There's nothing creepier than that, I think. And it's a sad story, but I'm just so grateful to you. Are the people behind Harvey Milk and folks like Jane Fonda, have any of them acknowledged this or disavowed it? Do they know about this?
There's nothing in the Milk Oscar-winning Milk movie. There's nothing in the Oscar-winning Milk documentary about the relationship between Harvey Milk and Jim Jones. As I said, they're naming the Terminal 1 at San Francisco Airport after him. Of course, the most significant thing that he did in his political career was champion Jim Jones. That's completely erased. It's completely thrown down.
Wait a minute. That's the most significant thing Harvey Milk did in his political career?
The one piece of legislation that he shepherded through in San Francisco was a dog mess ordinance where owners of dogs would have to clean up after them. Now, I'm sure there's some people that were very happy about that, but that pales in comparison to all of the lobbying efforts and that he's working on Jimmy Carter, working on the Prime Minister of Guyana. That is the biggest thing that these
unbelievable. And obviously your book details that. We're out of time. Daniel Flynn, thank you so much. Congratulations again on the book.
Thank you so much. Appreciate it.
Welcome to Focus Today. I'm your host, Perry Atkinson. And one of the topics that continue to pop up now and then is the whole issue of cults. And believe it or not, they're still quite active in our culture and around the world. And that different belief systems require different actions from different people. But it's also hard to believe that it's been 40 years since the Jonestown Massacre, where all these people took their own lives, 918 people. Well, I'm delighted to have with us today Daniel Flynn. He's the author of Cult City, Jim Jones, Harvey Milk, and 10 Days That Shook San Francisco. To kind of go back into this a little bit and to take a look at it and to figure out what happened and how it may influence some of the things that we're looking at today. So, Daniel, good to see you. Thanks for your time. How are you?
Outstanding. Thank you for having me.
You bet. I think we kind of scratch our head over this because we have a hard time believing that there is a belief system that would be like what happened with Jim Jones. But on the other hand, we're kind of scratching our head. There's a belief system worldwide that you kill others, and somehow that's to advance you into the kingdom of God. I mean, we're just kind of going, what's going on here? But let me ask you this. Number one question, can you define a cult?
I can't. It's sort of like you walk like a duck, it is a duck. And I think that's the way it is with a cult. I think certainly people in cults are sheltered from their family members, their loved ones. And that was the case in Jonestown, that they were cut off from people who were not in the cult. So if it is a belief system that separates people from outsiders, friends and families outside the cult, I think that's certainly one marker of a cult, and that was one marker of People's Temple.
One of the other definitions that I heard was that it starts with a belief system that we have the truth and nobody else does. In other words, we're propagating reality and truth and nobody else is. That seems to be somewhat a theological base to some of these cults. Would you agree with that?
I think so. The interesting thing about People's Temple is that at a certain point, Jim Jones stomps on the Bible. He writes a tract saying, pointing out contradictions in the Bible, saying it means it's not true. And when they get down to Jonestown, and I'll try to put this in a PG way for your viewers, Jim Jones confiscates all of the Bibles coming into People's Temple. At a certain point, they run out of toilet paper, and Jim Jones redistributes those Bibles and tells the people in People's Temple how to use them. So that's a very strange kind of cult in the sense that it was not a theological cult. Jim Jones believed that socialism was divinity, and that since he represented the personification of socialism on earth, that meant he was God. But otherwise, he didn't believe in God. After those 918 people die in Guyana, you have the New York Times claiming that Jim Jones is a preacher of fundamentalist Christianity. You have the Associated Press saying that these were religious zealots that killed themselves. So there was a first draft of history that made it seem as though Jim Jones and the people of People's Temple were some type of, moral majority Christian coalition types that had killed themselves in the jungle. Nothing was further from the truth. When Jim Jones asked his people to kill themselves on his behalf, he asked them to do so for the glory of communism, and that's on the death tape in Jonestown. That's something that kind of, after 40 years, gets lost by a lot of modern retellings of what happened in Jonestown.
Didn't he have his start as a Christian clergyman?
Ostensibly, yes. And when he was asked, why did you go into the church? And he said that when he was a young man, he asked himself the question, how can I demonstrate my Marxism? And he said the thought was to infiltrate the church. And that's precisely what he did. Now, Jim Jones was a liar and is not always the best authority on Jim Jones. So you can take what he says with a grain of salt. But I think that pretty much is how he saw his life going, that he wanted to use the form of the church, specifically aspects of Pentecostal Christianity, to get people involved in his movement. And at that point, he would seduce them with his political message, which was socialism.
Well, we here in Oregon, we're very familiar with this because we had Rosh Hashanah in our own backyard,
Yeah, and that would be a very similar situation. I mean, obviously, they didn't end up, I don't believe they ended up killing anyone when they poisoned people, but it was a very similar situation. And here's the interesting part. Leo Ryan, the congressman that went down and was killed in Jonestown, irony upon irony, is very cruel irony. When after he died, one of his daughters joined the particular cult that you just mentioned, and she was asked by the Washington Post, would you kill for this guy? And she said, I don't think he would ask me to. Essentially, she said, I don't think he would ask me to kill for him, but if he did, I would like to think that I would. That's the daughter of the man who died saving people in Jonestown, and life is just full of those cruel ironies.
We scratch our head and we say, how can this happen? How does this occur? How does this kind of propagation sink into a mind and that they would get over to it? Do you write about that?
I do. I think in the case of People's Temple, that one of the reasons people were seduced into the group is that they were able to attract a large number of celebrities, politicians, journalists, not necessarily to join their group, but to praise their group. And so at a certain point, Mayor Moscone of San Francisco appoints Jim Jones to the Housing Commission in that city. And Jim Jones very quickly becomes the chairman of the Housing Commission. When we think of people like Jim Jones, mass murderers, people like Charlie Manson or Ted Bundy, we don't think of them holding positions of great power in positions of civic responsibility. But that was the case with Jim Jones. Jane Fonda attended People's Temple services. She wrote Jim Jones a glowing letter saying that she wanted to be a full and active participant in People's Temple. And of course, Jim Jones thought of her as a member, and I don't think he was wrong to think of her as a member. Harvey Milk, who is part of the title of my book, Cult City, supervisor in San Francisco, he went on a very aggressive lobbying campaign on Jones's behalf, writing the President of the United States after Jones had kidnapped a little boy from the United States, saying that the boy's real parents, one was a bold-faced liar and the other was a blackmailer. He called Jones a man of the highest character. He wrote another government official, Joseph Califano, in Carter's cabinet, saying that Jonestown was alleviating the world food crisis. This is the place where people were starving. And he said that it was a beautiful retirement community where seniors would pay thousands of dollars to go there. So he was lying to world leaders and in Guyana and in the United States. And so if you're in the temple and you're seeing Huey Newton and Angela Davis speak to the group, the governor of California, Jerry Brown, spoke to People's Temple, and you're seeing all these bigwigs come through the temple, at a certain point you're going to say, wow, there must be something special to this guy that he has all these powerful people, all these famous people coming in here and talking to us. And I think the lure of People's Temple, in great part, was that the glamour of evil, that you had people coming in there that were very glamorous. We're putting a shine on Jim Jones. We're putting a shine on his evil. And I think for an ordinary person that had been sort of plucked from the ghetto or from Indiana or from wherever they came to join People's Temple, they're going to look at that and think, wow, I'm really proud to be a part of that.
Wow. All right, let me take a break here. We're talking to Daniel Flynn. He's the author of Cult City, Jim Jones, Harvey Milk, and 10 Days That Shook San Francisco. And do you have a website?
I am an editor at the American Spectator, so spectator.org. I have a website, flintfiles.org, but mainly I'm just I'm plugging the book and trying to get people interested in the book because I did spend 10 years writing the thing.
All right, we'll take a quick break. We'll be right back. Okay, welcome back. It's kind of hard to believe for those of us who are a little bit older that it's been 40 years since Jonestown and the Jim Jones cult and People's Temple and the massacre there in Jonestown, where all 918 people lost their lives. We're talking to Daniel Flynn, who spent, 10 years researching this. He's the author of Cult City, Jim Jones, Days That Shook San Francisco. There's a picture of the book there on the screen. You may want to check it out at the bookstores, called Cult City. All right, Daniel, fascinating to say the least. It's hard to believe it's been 40 years. Boy, I remember watching this in the news. I think the whole world was on tilt when all this was exposed. What finally drove them to drink the Kool-Aid? And that's where that term now has been used across the board in so many ways. But were they being found out? Was the authorities beginning to move in? What happened to poison?
Well, they had been drilling mass suicide for at least 4 years. And at the end of these drills, no one would die. And so a lot of people just thought that this was sort of a perverse loyalty test. When they went down to Guyana, these drills took on a more sinister fashion where it was presented to them that they were being invaded by outside forces that were kind of lurking at the perimeter of the jungle compound. And they were told that pretty soon that they would have to kill themselves because of this. Beyond this, Jim Jones told them that they were doing something called revolutionary suicide. They weren't just doing, a suicide that means surrender. They were doing revolutionary suicide, which came from a book title by Huey Newton that he had written in 1973. And according to Jones, they were protesting the inhumane conditions of the world and that they would all be dying sort of for the glory of communism and to protest capitalism. And that if they were to do this, their names would all go down in history. And the people in Jonestown pretty much bought this. And beyond that, if they didn't buy it, archers and gunmen surrounding everyone. So if they didn't drink the poison, there was another alternative there to die that way. And of course, Jones had already had 5 people killed on the airstrip. So rather enthusiastically, the people of People's Temple drank what was Flavor Aid laced with about a penny's worth of cyanide. They went into convulsions and they died rather quickly. And there were over 900 of them laying on top of one another in the hot jungle, decomposing very quickly. And it was not glamorous, and it was not for the glory of communism or anything else. They just died. And so Jones had effectively brainwashed a lot of them, but a lot of them were hardcore communists and really did believe that what they were doing was, not an act of just nothingness, but it was an act of purpose.
So there was no spiritual overtone to this at all. I mean, there was no hope if you give your life, you're going to have a better life. There's going to be a reward for you doing this.
There was a little bit of that. They believed in reincarnation, and there was one of Jim Jones's henchmen got up and said he had led many people from the earthly plane until this reincarnation plane, and that when they give up these bodies, that they would, if they were handicapped, they would get a new body and they'd be healthy and it would be great. And of course, there were about a third of the people there were elderly of some sort, and so that may have been appealing to them. And if of those 900 people there's only one person that speaks out, at least one adult who speaks out on this death tape. And her solution is, let's not kill ourselves. Let's all go to Russia. Let's all go to the Soviet Union. Such were the choices in Jonestown that it's either kill yourself or go to a communist country and live. And of those 900 or so people, only 4 people escaped. It's amazing the effectiveness of Jonestown. When the killings start, there's only 4 people who escape Jonestown who Jones didn't allow to leave. And when you think about those numbers, it's over 99% success rate of Jones killing all those people.
We've seen elements of this since Waco, Texas. And now it looks like the Church of Scientology is falling apart for some kind of cultic belief and commitment. And I'm hearing you say something here, Daniel, it's really interesting, that this was more political than it was spiritual or religious. And so I have to ask the question, is the spirit of this, if I can use that term, carrying over into politics today?
Well, I think the alpha and omega of People's Temple was politics. And it's very convenient for a lot of the tellers of history now to slap a religious tag on it. But it really was, it had the trappings of religion, and they certainly met in a kind of a church-like atmosphere. But there were no sermons, for instance, when they went down to People's Temple. It was Jim Jones going on rants and raves, and he was using all sorts of curse words and profanity. So it didn't resemble the typical Sunday sermon that you or I would see. They stopped celebrating Christmas. That was banned when they went down to Jonestown. Of course, I talked about him confiscating the Bible. I think you mentioned, what's the ramifications for today? I think there's a lot of people who make a religion of their politics, and that's very dangerous. And I'm not saying that all those people are going to die by killing themselves and drinking poison, but it's a very dangerous thing when you make your religion politics. And you're going to church is voting every 4 years or something like that.
Right.
MSNBC or Fox or whatever. There's something dangerous in that.
Yeah, no question about it. So back to Jimmy Carter, President Carter. What was his role in this?
Well, Jimmy Carter's wife, when she came to San Francisco, campaigned with Jim Jones in 1976, Rosalind Carter. Jim Jones introduced her before she spoke. They had dinner together. They talked on the phone. Rosalind Carter called Jim Jones, and Jim Jones actually taped the conversation without Mrs. Carter's knowledge. And Rosalind Carter referred her to Ruth Carter Stapleton, the president's sister, who was also involved in the ministry. So he was very much, he certainly knew Rosalind Carter. He, as far as Walter Mondale is concerned, Carter's running mate, when he came to San Francisco in 1976 to campaign, one of the first people he meets when he gets off the tarmac is Jim Jones. So it wasn't just the local crowd that was praising Jim Jones. They got a lot of national people involved. And when there is this custody dispute in Guyana, Carter's State Department, they really take the side of People's Temple. They don't intervene despite a court order. And beyond this, when defecting Temple members come to the embassy in Guyana and say that that all these people are planning to kill themselves, the embassy feeds information back to Jim Jones to sort of curry favor with him rather than stopping what happened. So I think there was a great dereliction of duty on behalf of President Carter's people. And I think part of that probably stemmed from the fact that his wife, his vice president, and a lot of other people who were close to him politically, at least, were friends with this guy, Jim Jones.
So no response when he left the United States and went to Ghana. I mean, he just picked up and left, and a lot of people followed him. That wasn't an alarming move for people or authorities to check it out?
It was an alarming move. And when people in San Francisco asked for investigations of People's Temple, they generally didn't get it. Let me just give you one example real quick. In 1975, People's Temple was thought to have played a huge role in getting George Moscone elected mayor. And some people speculated that they had bussed in improper electors into the city to cast fraudulent ballots. And so there was so much pressure that the local district attorney launched an investigation to see if People's Temple had done this. Who do they put in charge of the voter fraud investigation? But the second in command at People's Temple, who also just happens to have been appointed to the district attorney's office as a deputy. And lo and behold, he finds that the People's Temple had done nothing wrong. And so you essentially have this cult member investigating his own cult. I mean, what do you expect him to find? That's how in with the in crowd People's Temple was in San Francisco. So you had the district attorney's office that was in their pocket. You had politicians that were in their pocket. You had media members, journalists like Herb Cain. He won a Pulitzer Prize in 1996. He was called the voice and conscience of the city by the Pulitzer Committee. He was Jim Jones's biggest booster as far as people in the press are concerned. Paul Avery, who was played by Robert Downey Jr. in the movie Zodiac, he was a booster of Jim Jones, thought Jim Jones was great. And so all these minds that were supposed to be critical and discerning minds, they fell for Jim Jones. And it tells you a little something. A lot of the people are ridiculed who drank the Kool-Aid or who fell for Jim Jones, the rank and file members. But the reality is, before the poor drank the Kool-Aid in South America, the powerful did in San Francisco. And I think it's worth looking, and that's what my book does, is we look at these powerful people who fell for Jim Jones.
Yeah, that is just so amazing. All right, the book is entitled Cult City. One other quick question, Daniel. I don't think there was any connection between Jonestown and Waco, Texas, but there's a lot of similarities. Can you comment on that?
I don't know because, of course, a lot of the people at Waco have maintained that this was the government that sort of came in and that's why the fire started. I don't know if that's the case or not. But they claim that Koresh didn't commit mass suicide. And there's evidence to suggest that maybe he did. But the bottom line is that those people stayed in there for weeks and weeks and weeks when they could have come out, and Koresh could have let them out. I think the government really messed up at Waco. The government really messed up at Jonestown. And after the fact, they tried to blame the cultists, which, of course, the cultists had culpability big time. But the government also messed up as well. And I think that's probably the common denominator between those two events.
All right. Thanks, Daniel, for your time. Fascinating. Check out the book, folks, called Cult City. There's a picture of it there on the screen at the bookstores, Cult City, by Daniel J. Flynn. Thanks, Daniel. Good to see you. Thank you.
Outstanding. I appreciate it.
You bet.